So one thing real estate investors do a really bad job at is actually considering when it's the proper time to sell their investment property. So maybe cashing out, reinvesting the money, or simply just downsizing your portfolio is a good idea. But how do you know when it's the best time? Okay, so welcome back. My name is Cody. I'm an investor-friendly agent here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And if you are interested in how to grow your portfolio, or in this case, actually scale it down, let's connect. So selling an investment property isn't exactly the same as when you sell a regular property. Usually you're gonna have tenants in place. You have to decide on whether you want them out of the property and you're losing money every month holding that property, or if you wanna keep them in, but have to deal with showings around those tenants' times. You also have different capital gains laws. And then you've got the regular mix of selling a property, which is trying to make sure it's the proper time to sell and that your property is actually in high demand. So how do we ensure that your property is actually gonna sell for top dollar while not having it sit vacant for months with you losing money every month until it actually sells? Okay, so let's talk about the biggest elephant in the room with selling an investment property, and that's the tenants. Do you want to sell it empty with the tenants out, or with the tenants in, still making you monthly income? So both have their own pros and cons. Getting the tenants out obviously allows the property to show better. Usually you're going to want to do some renovations to make it, bring it up to current market value, clean the place, paint over the wall scuffs, update the trim that's been damaged, and that will allow you to sell at the highest amount. However, that takes time. It also takes more capital that you're injecting into your investment property, and not everyone wants to do that. On top of that, if you're in an area where it's very common for tenants to be rented, sometimes people want to buy a property with a tenant in place. And so there's a balance between selling something with tenants and something without tenants. And my answer on whether it's a good idea to sell with tenants or not, one, will depend on the area, but two, most importantly, will depend on actually the tenants themselves. If they are good quality tenants, I do think that is a benefit. If you're planning to sell this property to investors and they want something with tenants, having a good tenant in actually increases your property's worth because they can lock down that tenant with lease. If you're planning to sell the property to non-investors, then you don't want the tenants in there at all. Even good tenants, because non-investors, if they're going to buy that property, if there's tenants in place right now in Winnipeg, you have to give at least 3 months notice for possession date, which means somebody moving would have to wait 3 months plus before they can move into the property. And for a lot of people, that's a deal breaker. The only case where it's not a deal breaker is when they're buying that perfect property. And a lot of the times when you have tenants in place, it's not going to be that property because there's going to be small stuff that's wrong. They're not going to clean the place before every showing. You're probably not going to stage the place. And so for that reason, the answer depends on who you're selling to. If you're selling to people who are going to be investors and you have good tenants, keep them in. If you're selling to non-investors, get the tenants out. If you're selling to investors with bad tenants, then it's also get them out. Okay, and so what if you're in the scenario where you don't want to dump a much more capital into the property, but you also want the tenants out of there, but you know that it's not going to show as well? Well, in this scenario, you have to consider whether you want to sell for top dollar or not. If you're investing the money into the property before you sell, at least in a scenario where it doesn't sell, now you have a better product for rentals. If you don't have the capital to sell the property and you're selling for other reasons, then maybe it's better to sell it as is with the tenants in place. At least you're not losing that monthly income with the property being vacant. Okay, so let's talk about the rental demand for investors, right? So assuming you're not selling to somebody who is a non-investor, because in that case, you're gonna get the tenants out and you're gonna renovate to make it sell its best and you're gonna sell for top dollar. That is a little more simplified. Let's assume that you're actually selling to an investor. You have maybe decent tenants in place and you wanna know what is the demand for this investment, right? So the investor coming into buying this property also wants it to cash flow. And so that price that you're going to sell it at needs to make sense for that investor. Sometimes there's a disconnect between what the seller thinks it's worth and what the buyer thinks it's worth. Normally in a regular market, that disconnect can be bridged where the buyer actually thinks it's worth more. Often with investments, it's the other way around. And so usually the sellers are going to be too high. And so for you in this case, you have to understand that if the investment doesn't work for a buyer to buy it, the property is never going to sell. Okay, the other upsell I see what a lot of people try to implement is there's a higher value for this property than its current use. Maybe you can add a basement suite. Maybe it's a big lot for redevelopment. the most common objection you will get is, why haven't you done it, right? If it's so good, why haven't you gone ahead and done those additions, right? So often a smart buyer, when you're dealing with investors, you're not really dealing with this emotional connection. Often they're going to see through those types of scenarios unless there's actually proof in the pudding. And so if you want to sell to investors, it really starts with price. Price is the most important factor. The numbers need to make sense. And so price is going to flow down from what is it currently rented at? What are the property taxes? What are the insurance? And then you can get into the, okay, how would somebody increase the rent? Okay, maybe you go through the zoning process and actually get it zoned for R2 so that somebody can add a legal secondary suite in the basement. Now your property is worth more based on potential, right? And so you could see how this is a little different than when just selling to a typical buyer. Okay, and another common question I get is whether or not you should actually go through fixing the property while the tenants are in place, right? So maybe the property needs a coat of paint, but you don't want to have the tenants move out. Should you paint it or not? And that's where the area really comes into place. If you're selling in an area where people want turnkey rentals, then yes, you need to paint even with the tenants in place. A side note of that, when you're making improvements to the property, often, even if you have a registered or unregistered rent, you can justify a rent increase for the current tenants because of the improvements you're making. Okay, and often the tenants are actually happy to have these improvements because it's newer paint, newer appliances, an updated kitchen, maybe an updated in-suite laundry, other stuff like that, or it's worth it to them to have those increases. And so this is something where I actually specialize in. When I am selling an investment property with tenants, I try to treat the tenants like regular people. They seem to appreciate that, and that helps with buyer showings because the tenants are more lenient on letting buyers in. Often I ask that they're not present because for me as a buyer, when the tenants are there, that's a jackpot of information that the agent or the seller can't legally disclose, right? And so the problem is the tenants are often going to have a skewed view of the property, right? They might not fully understand something. They've never owned a house. They're just living there. They won't fully understand how a house works, right? They might say, oh, the grass never gets cut. It's so overgrown, when in reality, that might not be the case. Now, sometimes they do have good information and they're smart, but like I said, as a seller, you don't want to have the buyer have access to your tenant where they might be getting false information from. And so this is for me when I'm selling investment properties, and I've sold numerous duplexes now with tenants in place. I will always make sure that the tenants are taken care of because they are one of the #1 pitfalls for a deal. Because what we don't understand, or what people don't understand, is when the buyers are asking them questions, the tenants are just spewing information. Usually they're upset with the landlord regardless if the landlord's good or not. Sometimes they'll talk about how good the area is, but they're always going to have a couple of things that they complain about. And so if you're thinking about selling an investment property here in Winnipeg, I would love to help you. Let's have a quick chat about how we would position your property to make sure that it actually sells. It doesn't just sit on the market and continue to degrade.